All right. Welcome, everybody, to our Youth and Climate Justice podcast series today. My name's Maggie Heiser. I'm the communications manager here with Midwest BDC, and we are going to get started. And I see Jaleesa, our moderator, was able to join us, so I'm going to kick it over to her to get us started off today, and hope y'all enjoy this series. I'm really excited to hear it on the back end. So without further ado, we can get started.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. Now that we're getting started podcast, I want to start us off with introducing our wonderful speakers that we have with us today and their bios. So, our first speaker of today is Charles Hua, who is a policy analyst at Rewiring America, where he focuses on promoting federal, state, and local policies to advance equitable building, decarbonization. He has published research on environmental justice and state climate policies and equity in utility regulation, and helped write Harvard's sustainability action plan. Charles has advised Fortune 500 companies and international NGOs on sustainability issues. Serves on the board of directors for environmental nonprofits Slipstream, Energy News Network, and Clean Wisconsin. For his work, Charles has been recognized by the White House as a 2018 U.S. Presidential Scholar and as an Aspen Institute Future Climate Leader. I just want to take a second for us to give a round of applause for our first speaker, Charles Hua. Awesome. Our next speaker today is Jordan Irving. She is the Youth Program Manager at the Green Door Initiative. In her current role, she connects inner city high school students with opportunities to explore nature while using educational and hands-on programming to expose these students to unconventional career paths in natural resources, agriculture, forestry, maritime trades, IT, and college preparatory experiences. Have a second to shout out Jordan, and if you want, give us a wave.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And our third and final speaker for today is Tanisha Harris. She is Action for Climate Emergencies Associate Director of Youth Media and Partnerships. Having been introduced to the organization via a climate education assembly in high school, it is a full circle moment for her to be working for the organization that has inspired her to be a youth climate and environmental justice advocate. She helps ACE garner earned media opportunities, communicate with partners, and supports its coalition building efforts. One of her biggest accomplishments was organizing a CEJA photo banner delivery to the Illinois Governor Pritzker with 300 young people at the Capitol. Wow, the bill passed in 2021. So we have some very exciting panelists with us today, and I just want to give us a second to acknowledge all of the amazing work that they have been able to accomplish and in their youth. This is amazing. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a few questions I have for our panelists to answer today. And one of them being, after hearing your amazing bios, we've heard them, but is there anything else you all would like to add on to that? You've had some amazing accomplishments, but I want to make sure we have time to acknowledge the wealth of knowledge and information that you all bring here today.
Well, one of my favorite fun facts to share is that I've swum with 5 different species of shark, and most of them was before I knew how to swim. So that has nothing to do with this panel. It just breaks the ice a little bit.
That was great. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to share any unique qualities or information about yourself?
Well, mine is not as exciting, but for the past 7 years, I've been a certified yoga instructor. And for the past decade, I've been a mental health and wellness advocate. So I like to pair that with the work that I do with the young people as well, because nature, mental health and wellness, they all kind of go together. So that's my
They do. That is beautiful. And I'm seeing even in your bio that connection between internal and external wellness, even in our environments. And like you said, it's all connected. Charles, is there anything you would like to share with our with everyone that's on the podcast today?
Sure. I love taking trains. So I have a goal of taking every Amtrak route in the U.S. I've done a couple actually cross country train trips, one from Boston to San Francisco. I just love the feeling of being in a train and being surrounded by nature to some degree. You're inside, but you're also constantly in nature and just seeing all the different scenes and landscapes unfold in front of your eyes. I just love that feeling. So that's my
Yes,
fact.
I totally relate. And actually, I just got off of a train ride, an Amtrak train ride from Elkhart, Indiana to back to Chicago Union Station. And it feels like a constant panoramic picture of nature itself with a few blips of industry thrown in there. But it is a beautiful sight to see. And there were a few delays because of the floods in New York, and praying for all the folks who are going through that experience as well. Those are some really exciting facts, and I see each of you all's identity just coming out through those bios and through what you're sharing. But as we move on, I wanted to hear a little bit more about what got you all into the climate justice movement. What sparked your interest? And if we can start from Jordan to Charles and then maybe to Tanisha.
Okay. So I started as an intern working for the Green Door Initiative, whose CEO and founder is Donnell Wilkins, who's also been named the mother of the environmental justice movement in Detroit specifically. So by coming underneath her tutelage, I've been able to learn so much. And some of the first things that happened when I started my internship was finding out that uh, Detroiters have 3 times as much asthma attacks and hospitalization than, say, white counterparts. And I'm talking about Black residents versus white residents in Detroit. That fact really intrigued me, as well as the Flint water crisis happened when I started my internship. So I was kind of like, "Ooh, this is some intense stuff going on right now." And it was, we all have heard about police brutality and gun violence and, prison to or school to prison pipeline. But environmental justice was just this new concept that I was like, people aren't really talking about this. So that's kind of where my start came with the being in the EJ space.
Wow, that was everything summed up. That calls us to action. And even in my calling, it's the experiences that you yourself have lived through and your family and your neighbors are experiencing. Thank you so much, Jordan. And so now we're going to throw that question to you, Charles. How did you get into the justice movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, I feel there's many different ways to answer that and many different kind of origin points as I look back on my journey. Um, Frankly, I think it really starts with kind of my parents. They were Chinese immigrants. They moved from China to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I think growing up, it was always very apparent to me kind of all the sacrifices that they experienced as immigrants. And while they were privileged to not live in communities that necessarily faced environmental justice issues to the greatest degree when they moved to the United States. Seeing some of the challenges that they experienced and some of the injustices that they experienced nonetheless, I think from a young age really instilled in me the deep sense of conviction to do something about that. So my entry point in the climate movement was actually as a sophomore in high school. I was leading our school's green club at the time, and we had pitched a solar project to the school district. We wanted to do something impactful as a group of high schoolers, and the district came up with a bunch of reasons why we shouldn't and couldn't do that. We didn't have the money. We the roof needed to be replaced. They didn't think that there was community support. We decided as a bunch of youth to push ahead anyways. So we organized a petition campaign. We ended up raising over $150,000. We got a bunch of panels installed, and then we were like, how can we scale this to the next level? And so we started a campaign to get our school district to really accelerate climate action. And we worked with a lot of community residents and school board members. We got a couple thousand signatures, got them to pass that resolution, and they became the largest school district in the country at that time with a goal of 100% renewable energy. And throughout that whole time, I was frankly very often one of if not the only person of color in the space. And I started picking up from a very young age when I was reading through different kind of climate reports or strategic climate action plans. I was always in my head, why is equity and justice only mentioned in the first and the last page and never in between? And I think even as a high schooler, I knew that that wasn't right. And in college, when I started to have more kind of academic research and internship experiences that exposed me to a framework of how to talk about these issues, whether we're talking about environmental justice and the procedural, distributional, and other kind of components of that environmental justice framework, broadly speaking, that's when I really kind of was able to deepen my engagement around these issues even further. And so I was blessed to meet Jackie Patterson, who remains, will forever remain one of my climate and environmental justice heroes. At the time, she was leading the environmental and climate justice program at the NAACP. And we connected in 2020, and we were working on this report looking at the diversity of public utility commissioners across this country and the impacts that these bodies, these regulatory bodies, had on energy equity. And that process was just really fascinating to me. It exposed to me how fundamentally inequitable our regulatory system is. At the same time, it kind of exposed to me this idea that that actually is an opportunity for us to really change the structures. It's not a space that a lot of people are talking about or thinking about. But if we can figure out how we make sure that we develop policy and regulatory efforts to embed energy and climate justice in regulation, I think really important. And so that's fundamental to the lens through which I approach all of my climate and energy and environment work now. And I'm so grateful to have met a bunch of incredible mentors along the way.
Yeah. That is an awesome and multifaceted answer to that question, Charles. You've gone from your youth as a young teenager all the way to your adulthood and growing into your position. And the one thing that comes to mind, not to sound preachy, but in the Bible, it says, train a child up in the way that they should go and they'll never depart from it. And I'm just seeing that personified, that your parents had ingrained that care for earth, that care for your neighbor and community. And it's become realized into your action in regulatory commissions and environmental policy. And that is amazing. So now I'm going to give the question over to our final panelist, Tanisha. And can you answer what called you into the climate justice movement?
Well, first, I want to say the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition really did a great job selecting my fellow panelists. I don't know if you're aware, we all have a connection to Michigan. So in college, I did the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program led by the phenomenal Dr. Dorceta E. Taylor. And I went to Flint to do service work and learn more about the water crisis. And there was a lot of not only was it professional development and breaking down barriers in the conservation movement, but there's a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work and justice now that's being added on. But to answer the question, I like to say I was born into the movement, and because I lived and my family still lives in an environmental justice community, South Shore, which is on the south side of Chicago. And so there are a plethora of environmental justice issues in South Shore, ranging from just unrefined pet coke, which was a battle that we won, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It being a food and transportation desert, having some of the highest sources of air pollution. And once I went to high school, which was ironically, outside of my neighborhood, I had a very eccentric biology teacher who taught more environmental science and biology. And he brought my organization, ACE, to do a climate assembly at my high school. And I was like, I finally had the language to articulate what I was experiencing in my community. And but also, like, I also realized that there is an entire socioeconomic component to just climate, the climate movement, which is where that justice piece comes from. Because I went to a very selective enrollment school, Winnie M. Young Manet High School, alma mater of Michelle Obama, and when it came to conversations about nature and environment, I realized a lot of my more affluent or non BIPOC peers would say their connection to the outdoors would be more so recreational and very positive. So rock climbing or solar panels and solar energy. And mine was, I have a tree on my block that I really like to play around with my friends. Also, I was like, I also learned that it wasn't common for everyone, to have asthma and respiratory illnesses. And that really blew my mind. And so with that presentation and having a teacher that was extremely dedicated to teaching about environmental science, I became a youth climate and environmental justice activist before I knew what an activist was, because I realized that, even though I carry quite a few marginalized identities, I did have a privilege going to a very affluent high school. I did have a platform. I am very outspoken, and I have the knowledge and educational foundation underneath me. And I realized that why isn't my story or the stories like my community being told in these conversations about environmental science? Where are the intersections of race and socioeconomic status to environmental pollutants? And one of my biggest pet peeves in high school is that I had a textbook that said, well, low income people don't care about the environment because they have to worry about where their meal comes from. And I was like, you can do both. You can worry about where your next meal comes from and care about the air pollution in your community. So I decided to pursue a bachelor's of science in environmental science and continue dedicating my life to it. And it's felt like a very strong sense of duty and obligation, because I don't want anyone else to continue living through what I did.
Wow. You all have me so very excited, because Tanisha, I love your statement. You were born into this movement. And that is true for so many Black and Brown youth, so many Black and Brown people, period. And we're seeing higher rates of Black and Brown communities being disproportionately affected by industry, by pollution. And it's affecting our sources, our natural resources, our soil, our air, the water we're drinking. And so the only option, the most positive option, is to be a part of the movement, to be a part of the progress that we're hoping to affect and the change that we're hoping to see in the coming years. Doing nothing is a very debilitating option, and I'm just so excited and inspired to see so many young people like yourselves getting active in this movement. Our next question, I want to move it to how you all bridge an intergenerational movement. How can you use your organizing techniques from the past for future advocacy efforts? How do you envision yourselves reaching a younger or even the older generations in your work?
If you don't mind, I'd like to start this. So I'm very lucky that there is a very active and sustainable environmental justice community in Chicago and throughout Illinois. And so when I started my journey as an activist, I had a lot of the older generation reaching a helping hand to me and helping equip me with the skills, knowledge, and networking. So when I have something like this, I see the support coming from it. So Jordan, you mentioned working with the Mother of Environmental Justice in Detroit. I was able to work with the daughter of the Mother of Environmental Justice nationally, Cheryl Johnson, and her mother is Hazel Johnson. And that legacy comes out of Chicago, but has widespread reaching ramifications across the country, if not the globe. And so I really love the power of storytelling. I think, and this is coming from a trained scientist who loves data and facts and experimentation, that does not move hearts and minds, unfortunately. I really wish it did, but I realized that people really wanted to hear my perspective, my voice, my experiences. Sometimes it's the first time they're hearing something that goes against their own silo. Sometimes it's reinforcing, like the ACE Climate Assembly was to me. It's like, oh, now I know the language and the terminology to describe what I'm feeling. And also, it's kind of like it's a bridge to overcoming those different life experiences. So you always have your story. It's something no one can take away from you. And when I'm helping to build an intergenerational movement, I'm always thinking about how can one story elevate another. So how can Cheryl Johnson and I talk? We're still talking about the same thing, environmental issues in Chicago, but what does that look like? Where does it look like from someone who was there at its inception to someone who, like my age now, who's living through it and can see the progress that has been made, but also like there is more to be done. And so one, I think using the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, like when you make a place at the table for young people or older people or those in between, you have to make sure it feels like an inclusive environment where they can thrive and want to stay. And so I approach all of my work with that lens, but then thinking about what is the justice component of it now. So DEIJ. So, you have the diverse table, you've met the needs of everyone to attend at the table. It's inclusive. Now, what are solutions to enact? And how do we make sure those solutions aren't going to harm the marginalized communities? Because I've experienced solutions to environmental issues that do undue harm to environmental communities in the name of, oh, we need clean energy. And I'm like, that's not how I roll. And that's how the youth climate movement does not operate that way either. And so it's really extending the use of storytelling to overcome that barrier, and then the principles of DEIJ to keep that community sustainable.
Wow, that is very true. And I've seen that even manifest in the work that I've been doing in Faith in Place. We're using that tool of storytelling to be able to make statistics and data digestible. That is amazing, Tanisha. So I'm going to throw that question back to you, Charles. How do you be a bridge to the intergenerational movement? How can you use your organizing techniques from the past to build a bridge between the older and the younger generations to include them in this movement?
Yeah, I think this is so important, and you'd think that it gets talked about more, given that so much about climate change is generational. But I think the intergenerational, the inter part, gets lost so often because there's not that many spaces that I've at least been a part of that are fundamentally and intentionally designed to bridge generations. I'll start by kind of, I guess, answering a slightly different question, which is why is that important? And the way that I characterize it is, I'll start just sharing kind of when I was growing up in high school. I I've always been super into math and numbers and data. And in my mind, I was like, I don't have 30 years to wait until I get a PhD and then become a professor in energy systems to tackle this climate change issue. So what could I bring to this space in the meantime? I'm still going to work on developing kind of the technical skills, the deep grounded knowledge and understanding of climate and energy systems and issues and how I can advance climate solutions. But in my mind, I realized that what I fundamentally, as a young person, brought to this space was a couple things. First, it was a deep urgency and passion for this issue that you just can't experience to the full degree, I would say, unless you're somebody who intently grew up with this issue and was told sort of from childhood that this was going to be one of the, if not the biggest issue facing our generation for the rest of our lives. So it's that urgency. But I think second, it's a deep ability to connect the dots and see the big picture and have a systems thinking and holistic perspective around this issue. Whereas folks who are like decades into the climate and energy space might view things as just a technological problem or just a scientific problem or just a emissions and molecules problem, as I like to describe it sometimes. I think young people realize that fundamentally it's a people and community problem. In addition to those things, it's not just decarbonization, it's equitable decarbonization. It's not just climate, it's climate justice. And I think that ability to see the big picture and understand how racial equity and housing policy and public health and all these things fit in together, they're all related. And so that's why when I see some things like, particularly from older folks, that, the Green New Deal is a bad policy because, the climate problem is hard enough. If you layer on all these things like social equity and racial justice, like that's going to antagonize conservatives or other folks. And my reaction to that is, but how can you actually separate those issues? They're all related to each other. If we think about, this is the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. If we think about building decarbonization and the building stock, it's important to recognize that not everybody comes from the same context, whether, some housing stock might have lead, mold, or asbestos. So electrification is not something that may make sense in the near or medium term. And then the third thing that I would say that young people bring, and that's related to the second point that I was making, is a fundamental ability to center and want to center justice and equity in this work. That's crucial. That's something that I've noticed, that there is a generational divide that I've noticed where there's a lot deeper and nuanced understanding across the board from younger folks that I've seen. So that's my case for intergenerational dialogue. Now, how do you actually make that happen? I think that has to be a two-way street. Both younger folks and more experienced folks want to, or need to, I should say, want to come together and kind of intentionally foster those relationships. So on my end, I was always a shy kid growing up, but I learned to kind of advocate for myself, learned to be more appreciative of public speaking, and I started to reach out to folks. Like I reached out to Jackie, and I reached out to other folks who became my mentors. I spoke up when I felt like it was important to do so, and I found my voice. And I think that's really important for younger generations to take the initiative to do that. It's very easy to kind of have this fatalistic mindset that, older folks in charge aren't going to be able to figure things out. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't try to actually build relationships with folks who are more experienced. They do have decades of experience in the space that we can learn from as well. On the flip side, and I think that in particular, because more experienced and older generations have the resources, whether financial, intellectual, social, et cetera, to be able to be more intentional, I think that is so important. Like, I think spaces like this one that are intentionally carving out spaces for younger folks to participate is very important. I've seen organizations, some do this well, but frankly, most organizations don't really care about putting and centering youth perspectives in this space. And I think that's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And so it has to be a two-way street. Young folks got to step up to the plate and want it. Older folks need to recognize how and when to pass the torch and be very intentional about fostering relationships with younger generations. And I think it's only then when we're actually going to be able to kind of really address this problem the way that it should.
Wow, that is beautiful. And one thing you really highlighted is that necessity for relationship and how it is a two-way street in building this newer environmental movement, knowing that young people need something from the older generation. And there are a lot of things that the younger generation can provide to continue that growth, that movement, and that energy that we bring to the table. So thank you so much, Charles. And I'm going to pass it to our other panelist, Jordan, to answer the question in bridging the gap between this intergenerational movement. How can you use your organizing techniques from the past to build the future advocacy efforts?
Well, to start, I can only really agree totally and completely with Tanisha and Charles in the sense that there are organizations out here who are already doing this work. Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, Green Door Initiative, We Act, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. The list really goes on and on. And when Tanisha said the point about telling our stories, this movement has been going on for decades. This work, these struggles have been happening for decades. So combining young people and bringing more opportunities for young people and these different organizations to come together and those stories to be told from these different perspectives, telling the story of the past as well as, hey, where are we now? I think having those conversations and creating more opportunities for these two generations to merge is crucial, because we're not going to know where we're going if we don't know where we've been. So that's super important. The other piece I would say is something that we do at Green Door Initiative is empower young people to be citizen scientists. So creating opportunities for them to do stewardship projects, creating opportunities for them to actually test their soil, for them to test the water, for them to monitor the air, so that they can actually be a part of the research that is allowing them to know, like, hey, is this good air? Can we grow vegetables in this soil? Is this water good enough to drink? These are techniques that people have been using for the last 2 to 3 decades. People have been testing soil. I know air monitoring is one of the newer things that have been employed through the EPA and different air monitoring systems, but exposing young people and older generations to this new technology so that it's kind of like this fun way of figuring out, like, hey, is our environment safe, or, are we on that borderline, or is it just all bad pretty much? But it's a way to get young people and older people interested in having those conversations about, okay, what is the state of our environment right now where we live?
Wow.
The other piece I would say, and I'm gonna wrap this up quick, is that teaching young people about how they can engage with our legislative branch. So what does that look like? Like I said, the generations of the past, they don't care. They'll write a letter, they'll send an email, they'll picket, they'll make a sign and a banner, and they'll go to the rally, they'll go to the public hearing. So how do young people engage with our legislative branch? How do they get their voices heard? If there's a bill that's a healthy climate initiative, how can they support it? Teaching them that way. Or if it's something that they're against, how do they go about letting their state representatives know, like, hey, this doesn't make any sense, this is not supporting our community. And once again, that storytelling piece of, hey, this is what's going on in my community, this is what's affecting me. That is the stuff I feel that pulls in our state representatives, our senates, and basically opens their eyes to saying, like, okay, so it's not about just the statistics, but these are real people and we need to address their issues. So that's what I would say.
You all, oh my goodness. So, one thing I'm getting from each and every one of us in this conversation is the importance for community building and civic engagement. And Jordan, you really highlighted the immense opportunity there is when we put all of the generations into a room for us to learn together, because there's definitely information out there and newer technology out there that even we haven't scratched the surface on, and building environments that are safe enough for all of us to ask the questions that we need, or say whatever the comment is, and speak to the experiences that we're living in the same room really bridges and creates an environment for that communication and building. Thank you all so much. For those who are on with us who are wondering how they can connect and support these younger activists, I want to throw the question out there to you all. If you can give some suggestions on how can experienced or seasoned climate activists support the youth.
I can start.
Of course.
One of my favorite things to say is pay them. Pay them. Give them money.
I'm
For
with that.
Yep, pay them. And not just pay, and definitely, yes, monetary, yes, pay them, but create opportunities for them to earn certifications, get training, give them opportunities to shadow and intern, all of those things. The young people, I mean, they're trying to make it just like everybody else, and a lot of young people, their parents are like, hey, you got to pay your own cell phone bill and put gas in your car. So as Tanisha was saying, how can their minds be focused on all these higher level environmental causes and issues if they're struggling to get lunch every day? We have to give some incentives that are going to allow them to know that, hey, like all four of us get paid to do this work. This is our livelihoods. This is how we pay our bills, and we're helping people as well. So opening their minds to see that that is a possibility, and yes, you can get paid to do good work. It doesn't always have to just be, your civic duty, but I love what I do and I make money, and I get to do the fun things like be on podcasts and travel the world and go to different conferences. Like there's so many benefits to this work. The other thing that I would say is, and one thing that I'm working on is building a youth advisory board. So I want to be able to pay my students as consultants for different organizations to get young people engaged, because a lot of older generations have started these organizations, and they're trying to figure out, like, well, how do we get young people involved? How do we, get them interested in this? And I think we need to just ask them. We need to just ask young people. Let's just go to the root, ask them what interests them, and what would we need to do to make this whole concept of climate justice more interesting, and just, how can I say, pull them in so that they actually want to be a part of the movement. And lastly, I would say using our resources and our networks to break down barriers for them. So just like Charles mentioned, when he was in school, they're trying to do this solar and this clean energy initiative. There's going to be barriers. There's going to be adults that say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, or that's not feasible. How can we use our connections to kind of wiggle around and get them to talk to the right person, whether it's the school board or, whoever that might be, just using our connections to move a lot of the nonsense out the way so that they can actually have the floor to speak. So, that's my piece.
Jordan, you have some fans in the chat. I just have to go to that very quickly. Ren Martin commented, ain't that the truth? Too often good opportunities go unpaid or are very competitive. June Kelsaw said, what she said, period. And that is so true. I remember commenting in a few group discussions, and the issue is that we were getting people from outside of communities that are more affluent participating in programs that were for the students that are suffering and enduring the environmental harms in certain communities. And that is because their hierarchy of needs are not being met by the program that you're providing. And bringing to the forefront that, yes, students in certain neighborhoods are interested in wanting to engage, but there is a necessity for monetary compensation and not just a good job. This was nice of you to show up for. So thank you so much, Jordan, for speaking on that, creating those networks and using those opportunities to connect young people and going straight to the source are those three things that you mentioned. I want to leave that question with Tanisha and Charles. And let me restate it. How can experienced or seasoned climate activists support youth?
I'm so glad this says season too, because I often have an identity crisis of me, like, I am one of the oldest young people now, and it was not that way a few years ago. But with my work at ACE as the Associate Director of Youth Media and Partnerships, one of the most rewarding aspects of my job is being able to work with the younger youth activists, some who are just dipping their toe into, others that are slightly more established, and we pay them first and foremost. So yes, Jordan, and just to like shine a light on that a little bit, what you were saying, Jordan, I was that student struggling to find my next meal when I was a child. And, I depended on free or reduced lunch. And I really hated breaks because I was like, where am I going to eat? Oh, I've never shared that before. Okay. Anyway, but having those just basic needs met by the programs that are out there to attract young people are first and foremost vital to the sustainability of young people. But once you get them there are so many opportunities that with just a little bit of guidance and mentoring, the young person can shine. So I work directly in earned media. So I prepare young people to be in front of the press. And it's been quite successful. My young people have been published from everywhere from Teen Vogue to New Thinking, The Messenger. I land them podcasts, radio shows, TV interviews, and I sit down and I teach them. Like, it's not, I write the op-ed and I put your name on it. No, I'm going through several meetings to say, you need to change this. This was really great. Let's amplify your story more. And I pump them so full of confidence, because one of the things that got me through my start as a youth climate activist was someone just saying to me repeatedly, like, your story is the most powerful thing you have and no one can take that from you. And so anytime I'm meeting with a young person and they're nervous and they're like, oh, I'm about to be on camera, or I don't know if my op-ed's going to be picked up, or I don't know how to go speak to this legislator, I say, you should really bank on the fact that you're young and a student, because they eat that up. And you can use that for as long as you want to, because I still use it. But also, like, thinking about the type of programs that are out there, I've experienced gatekeeping and the broader climate movement, where if you don't have like this amount of fame as a youth climate activist, you can't be here. And I'm like, no, that's not how we should operate. Local activists are just as important as the activists who are working on national campaigns. And just because this person doesn't have the biggest platform or a well-known name, they still have a story that is unique to them, that resonates with someone else in the audience, that if you train them well to be a great public speaker or to just share their story very well, they will be as captivating as that speaker that can bring in just thousands of people with their name. And so eliminating the gatekeeping, providing opportunities for mentorship, and then meeting the basic needs that, to be honest, if you want to attract the young youth climate activists from marginalized communities, you have to pay them. Because when I was in college, heck, when I was in high school, I couldn't do an unpaid internship. I just wasn't feasible. So, but I would like to think people see me as stellar. So there are other me's out there. There's other Charles out there. There's other Jordans out there. And we just need to break down the barriers to find them.
Thank you so much, Tanisha. Oh my goodness. You spoke to a lot of what Jordan was saying, and you even added on using your skills to be able to prop up and end the gatekeeping world within the environmental movement. And just to see, I actually want to take a minute to look into the chat really quickly, because when we're speaking of you training people up, and using your skills, we have Gregory Norris, who can attest to that, saying you taught him and several other members how to use Slack. So that is real deal happening within Tanisha's work and present on this chat today. And I just want to say thank you so much for that. And I want to pass it to Charles. How can seasoned and experienced climate activists support you?
Yeah, it's tough to follow those two really thoughtful responses. There's this famous phrase, I guess, which is talent is evenly distributed, but opportunities are not. And I think that is true from so many lenses and perspectives. When I think about some of the best ideas that I've seen from a climate solution standpoint, on this theme of around intergenerational dynamics, frankly, most of them have come from folks on the younger side of the spectrum. Again, it's because of the things that I shared before in terms of younger folks have grown up with this issue, see the big picture, connect the dots, understand the holistic systems thinking perspective, center justice and equity in this work. But the problem is, and this gets back to the points that Jordan and Tanisha were making, which is they may not have the funding or the relationships or the platform or the recognition to be able to scale that work. And so I think that's something that a bunch of different stakeholders can do something about. So if you're a philanthropy, for example, think critically about whose work it is that you're funding. I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but it's a fraction of a percentage of points of funding in the climate philanthropy space going to young BIPOC leaders and their organizations. That's not acceptable. If you're an employer, whether in the private or public sector, you can step up and be a mentor. A lot of young folks might not value or know how to value mentorship, particularly if they're still a teenager, and so they might just be afraid of coming up to somebody who's much more experienced and might not know how best to approach that. And so sometimes all it takes is just being able to break that ice and being proactive in approaching younger folks and sort of being very clear about offering up capacity and mental energy and space to be a mentor. And I think that's really important because for me, thinking about how I've gotten to where I am and how my perspectives around climate justice have been shaped and influenced, it would have been impossible without the mentors and the wonderful mentors that I had. And so that is so important. And, in addition to that, you can think about if you serve in some kind of decision-making capacity, centering justice, centering youth perspectives, even just doing the bare minimum of bringing in youth into the space is so important. You can push your employer or your community or your school board, et cetera, whatever it is. Everybody's part of some institution or another. And so therefore, everybody has an opportunity to kind of get that institution to center youth perspectives, particularly those who are most impacted by these issues. So that's what I would say. And I think that if folks are very intentional about that, young people will really be able to blossom and flourish. And those ideas won't just be ideas. They'll be the default strategy for tackling these issues.
Wow, that was amazing, Charles. And you know what? A lot of seasoned and experienced climate activists are finding themselves becoming the stakeholders in the room. And hearing you say, like, as people yielding and holding those positions, how do we identify spaces and opportunities to bring in younger people and doing that intentionally? That is amazing. Um, wow, I'm just blown away by you all's answers to these questions, because a lot of the times people don't know where to go when they're thinking of including younger people in their environmental actions or activism. So thank you all for those responses. So we're going to move on to the next question. And we've talked a little bit about how climate change disproportionately affects marginalized communities. What I want to know is what strategies you all recommend for youth leaders to address these inequities and ensure that climate justice initiatives prioritize vulnerable populations. Oops, anybody would like to go first? You can take that one. And I can repeat if you need me to.
Well, I'd like to take that one. So, as a youth climate leader from a marginalized community, I found what resonates with me the most is building out space in those decision-making areas where I can use my knowledge and my experience to address any inequities. So I think it's really good to remember that a lot of young people feel powerless and are somewhat not powerless, but do not have the same tools that, say, like a person who can vote has. So, and I say that because ACE works primarily with high school students. We work with teenagers. So 12 to 18, maybe 13 to 18, that's where we are. And we have found so much success working in that age group, but it's an age range that a lot of institutions shy away from. So really, again, going back to like, how do you build out a space for a young leader with that identity, with that age, who cannot vote, who cannot really vote with their dollar either? Their entire life is determined by someone else, where do you create opportunities for them to address inequities in the climate movement? And I love the youth climate movement because it has been born in a more progressive thinking, more justice focused environment. And so there is already like we've seen in the climate movement, when these inequities have come, there youth climate leaders are very quick to address them. So I think youth climate leaders are already addressing these inequities, and it's whether like they have the proper tools and are in the right spaces to go above and beyond with that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tanisha. And I'm going to pass it to Jordan next to tell us a little bit how we can address engaging youth in marginalized communities and what other activists and seasoned and engaged activists can do to do that same work.
Well, I'm going to answer this really quickly. So I would say young people can team up with organizations who have access to grant funds that are in alignment with their core values. So, for example, a lot of the grants that Green Door Initiative gets, they're for marginalized communities. I live and work in Detroit, and the young people that I work with live and go to school in Detroit. So those funds are directly geared towards them, that population. So, and the grant funding, well, a lot of our organizations are nonprofits. So once again, grant funded. Once you see who's funding these projects and what their initiatives and objectives are, then it's easier for you to align yourself with their core values and say, hey, okay, this is for, community gardens in marginalized communities. I'm into that. Or this is for, outreach as it pertains to water quality and water testing. I'm into that. So aligning with the organizations that have the money to do the work that you like, it ends up working out well in that way. And the other piece I would say is that our young people are so talented. Like they're app developers, they create websites, pieces of art, media projects. Bring all that to the movement. Because once again, I think storytelling is the absolute biggest and most intriguing piece that we can bring to the table as we bring ourselves to this movement. So just really encouraging young people to tell your story from your community, tell your community struggle, tell them, if you have asthma, if your grandma has had a heart attack, if, whatever, if somebody has cancer, tell the truth. Tell the truth of what you've experienced. And I really think that once we speak truth to power, it allows us more space to get more exposure. And once again, fuel the movement and keep it going.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jordan. And we're going to give that question to you, Charles. If you need me to repeat it, just let me know.
I honestly don't think that I could have answered it any better. So I just +1 to what Jordan and Tanisha said.
Awesome. And I want to give us some opportunity to get to another question. And if we can start off with you, Tanisha, for this one. With the growing urgency of the climate crisis, how can young activists balance the need for immediate action with the long-term systemic changes required to combat climate change and sustainability? I'm going to pause it there and I'll come back with a part 2 for that one.
I really appreciate this question because it really touches on a tension point between the youth climate movement and young people and the older climate activists in this movement. Just as a young person, not with my ACE hat on, I suffer from climate anxiety to the point where I have nightmares about it, and I forego really large life decisions that I would love to be able to do, but that, like, what does the future look like? So I really resonate with young people who are like, we need immediate action. And in terms of balancing that with long-term systemic change, I think you can do both, honestly. I feel like you can, like the Inflation Reduction Act being passed or the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act being passed in Illinois to put us on track to 100% clean renewable energy, and that's for Illinois by like 2050. That is long-term planning, but also within that bill, you have the development and the boom of the clean energy industry where you're creating pipelines and training programs and giving wraparound services, which starts immediately. So you're building up that clean energy sector and you're building up the workforce to get us to that by 2050 everything is carbon free. I think there is a need for both, and I think the tension comes from the fact that, again, this is just my perspective. I sometimes don't feel like adults really feel a sense of urgency that young people feel, because I think older generations have had an opportunity to live their life, and they've like, oh, I've lived through this crisis, and it's never been as bad as it was. But this is our first time living with a large existential crisis that it has widespread ramifications, and even the most privileged community in the world is going to deal with it at some point and in a very extreme, harmful way if you're not already a part of a community, like an environmental justice community. I think there needs to be a yes and a both, a bridge between the two of us where like I can feel confident maybe purchasing a home, but also, like understanding that these transitions take time.
That is so true. There seems like sometimes the older generation is like, okay, we're almost out of here, so whatever happens, happens. But that anxiety that comes from the younger group of their younger generation, knowing that they have to live through and endure whatever changes the environment throws our way. So we're coming to the close of our conversation, and I'm going to throw this question at you, Jordan and Charles, but just to give us a heads up, we're coming to a close. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left for our podcast. So if you could quickly give us a response to that question, how should younger people balance the long-term and short-term systemic changes that are happening when they're combating the climate crisis?
Yeah.
And
Jordan,
if
you got an answer real quick first? It's
Yeah,
a good
sure.
question.
No problem. I'm with Tonisha on the you can do both. Start now where you are. Start small. Like I said, community gardens, community cleanups, school cleanups. Charles, you're a prime example of seeing things that they can do. Advocating for recycle bins in your school, advocating for wooden foodware or cookware. You know what I mean? Because I mean they still have plasticware and styrofoam for school lunches. So advocating for that, starting a club, a sustainability or climate justice club, seeing who in your community actually cares about this type of stuff and joining forces with them is this small piece that really adds up to a big impact. And the thing is, we can change the world literally by just changing where we are. Just that small piece makes a difference everywhere we go. And I think the key is to not get overwhelmed and to breathe through it and to realize that every little bit helps.
Yeah.
And it's a lifelong work. It's not just something that, oh, you did that one thing and it's like, oh, yeah, it's over. No, it's a lifelong journey. So with any journey, you just take it day by day, do a little bit, at a time, and stay positive. Stay
Yeah.
positive.
Thank you so much, Jordan and Charles. If you want to add anything to that very quickly.
Yeah. I'll be quick. I'll just say, young folks, we got to be ready to step up to the plate. Like if we think about, who's driving climate policy, certainly young folks are growing in terms of influence, ideas, innovation, impact. At the same time, a lot of folks who have, again, decades of experience in the space, like if you look at the energy sector, it's a pretty old workforce. And at some point, young folks are going to need to step up to the plate and serve in more leadership roles. And the more that we can kind of build both the hard skills in terms of like the knowledge of climate and energy and environmental justice solutions, as well as the soft skills like emotional intelligence, empathy, compassion, leadership, listening, storytelling, etc. The more that we can all really figure out how to kind of cultivate all of that, as we're also recognizing that we do have a voice and potential to make impact now. I think this question to me is like the one that I ask myself all the time. And it goes back to the question that I had always growing up in high school when I first got involved in this, which was, I don't have a PhD in energy systems engineering, but is there something else that I can offer? And my answer to that for anybody, any young person of color, is absolutely. And just figure out what that is.
Wow. Thank you so much, Charles and Jordan and Tanisha. And as we close out, I want to go and pivot to some Q&A, to a Q&A session from the comments in the comment section and from a few other sources. One of the commenters is June, and she asked, what courses should high school students concentrate on?
I'd love to tackle this one. So, Action for the Climate Emergency has a flagship educational program called Our Climate, Our Future. And the reason this educational program, which is an entire website dedicated to the facts and science, but also the anecdotal stories and experiences of young people experiencing climate change, is because I don't know how to answer the question of what class you take. It really depends on what school you go to and where that school is located. For example, we offer Our Climate, Our Future in Florida, and Florida has very stringent climate education standards that are not suitable and they're not adequate. And there was even some news that PragerU, which is an anti-climate change behemoth, was becoming the approved supplemental material. So it's really hard to say what class you take. It really depends on what you're being offered. I went to a high school that had an environmental science course and a biology teacher who just loved environmental science. So I would say it's not necessarily the class you take in high school. It's really like, where do you find your material? So Our Climate, Our Future, visiting some of the websites and like kind of developing that curriculum for young people, is a better start than trying to me, pinpoint like, this is the class you need to take. And if there is an environmental science class offered or an environmental studies class, an environmental justice class offered in high school, please take that class. But it's not everywhere. It's very rare.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanisha. And I'm going to throw this question to Jordan as well, if she has anything to add.
Yeah, like Tanisha said, I don't think there's a lot provided in high school these days. I feel like they've cut off more classes than they've added to curriculums. So after school programs like Green Door Initiative, we have a summer youth employment program, and it's all about natural resources and getting familiar with environmental justice and climate justice. And there's other organizations that do that as well, but it also depends on what you're interested in. So maritime trades, so that's everything having to do with career paths along the waterfront. That's water conservation, water restoration, electrician trades. Like as somebody in the comment mentioned something about getting students engaged with hands-on like energy and electrician type trades. DTE actually has a program that is geared towards educating youth on all the energy trades, because we are moving towards more of a solar and a wind energy source. So I think you're going to have to go further than your high school to really get some of the extra knowledge. And that's why a lot of nonprofits are out there. We Act has like a fellowship program. There's a lot of other organizations, but I definitely think that if you want to get involved in this arena, you're going to have to branch outside of yourself into these kind of unknown spaces.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And for lack of time, we're going to move on to our next Q&A question. Someone commented, Do you all have any recommendations on how to get younger generation excited about the trade side of sustainable building, electrification, and the hands-on work needed to get this economy transformed? And Jordan, you were just sharing a little bit about how do we garner their attention and intrigue on these topics.
I can add to that just a little bit. So I'm really big on tours, getting tours of facilities if they'll allow it. Like I said, I'm currently working with DTE, and it's interesting because Detroit already has a very kind of funky relationship with DTE, but at the same time, it's kind of like they are our electricity provider. Like there's no way around it. So we have to engage in some kind of way. So why not create a positive avenue for young people to engage, get skills, get training, get money, get certifications by way of these entities, and it helps them look like a good corporate citizen. But at the same time, just like how they use us, we got to kind of use them. So that's why I bring up DTE and some of their electrician programs geared towards energy resiliency and whatnot. Also, just like the Green Door Initiative, we do a lot of hands-on activities. We do construction one-on-one. Just this past summer, my students helped an urban farm build 2 outdoor kitchens. So that was super cool. Things like what is it? I'm losing it. Yeah, things like getting their hands dirty. So like gardening, things of that nature. Getting them outside is always going to be one of the biggest things for getting students engaged in that manner. And unfortunately, I can't think of the last point, but I would say making it acceptable for students to understand that they do not have to go to college to make a great living. Making that part acceptable, because everybody thinks they're going to college, and college is not for everyone, and people are making a lot of money doing hands-on work and using their hands. So opening up those trades and just trying to changing that whole mindset that college is the only way you can make over $100,000, because I think we all know that is not the case. Yeah. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And you, just to sum that up, tours and exposing them to a future workforce and the money that can come with it. That is awesome. Tanisha, Charles, do you all want to also add to that?
I'll be quick. So I love the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in Illinois, and it's not because I helped work on it and write it, but it specifically has funding programs for young people to get into the clean energy workforce and get those trade jobs. And it addresses a lot of the racial and socioeconomic inequities that, if we're talking, looking at the makeup of this panel, thinking about marginalized communities, there are a lot of barriers to entry even for those workforce trade jobs. So I think it's it's multifaceted approach of like, one, destigmatizing going into the trades in general, and then making sure that, again, with the principles of DEIJ, that these jobs are accessible to marginalized communities. And so one of the ways we do that is that there is a pre-program in case you, at the time of application, you don't have the basic math competency, right? So you have that pre-apprenticeship program for the pre-apprenticeship program to the apprenticeship program, and you're paid for all of that. There are wraparound services, childcare, transportation. We'll help you get a suit or the dress for the interview, a career pipeline. And so CEJA provides almost any barrier that we could think of or the community's thought of. We overcome that in some shape or fashion, and it's very attractive to young people. But also, again, a part of my work at ACE, I'm bringing young people to an event called the Clean Energy Championship Awards, which is an award ceremony for those trade jobs, and like hoping like, hey, this is also a pathway, because like Jordan said, not everyone can go to college.
Thank you so much, Tanisha. And Charles, if you had something to add before we wrap up, and we have to go just anything with the 1 minute time frame.
Yeah, I'll try to do 30 seconds. I think policies help. I think CEJA, like Tanisha mentioned, is great. What the new kind of American Climate Corps initiative is trying to do around building a youth workforce is great as well. To the extent that we can get folks realizing that this is very lucrative financially as a career, and also that you get to help build America's future, and that's a pretty cool mission, I think. And then for the people like me who have no hands-on skills, uh, there's other things that we can do. And I think this gets back to some of the points that we've made throughout this podcast and some comments I've left, which is you got to figure out what it is that you want to bring to the space, what it is that you're good at, what it is that you have perspectives on. And the cool thing about the climate space is that there's space for everybody. And so that is actually also my answer to the what would you do in high school or college or even in the early years of your career or even late years in the career is figure out what you're good at, what you're passionate about, and what you have perspective on, and just do that.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to all of our panelists today. And before we wrap up, I want you all to share how people can reach out to you, plug your socials, and let them know how they can connect with you.
Well, you can follow me on Instagram with my name, Tanisha Harris, or you can always go through Action for the Climate Emergency to reach me. Or you can contact me via LinkedIn, Tanisha Harris, or my email address, which is tanisha@aspace.org.
Awesome. And Jordan?
I can be reached on Instagram at yoga diva5_. It's my personal. It's all good. And my email, jordan@greendoorinitiative.org.
And Charles, last but not least?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just Charles Hua, and my Twitter or X or whatever they call it is Charles Churros.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. And very quickly, make sure to set a reminder on your social platforms to tune in at the same time next Thursday for our next panel in the series, Youth and Indoor Air Quality. You can learn more about Midwest Decarb at midwestdecarb.org/calendar. Thank you all so much for being here with us today, and I hope to see you next week. All right. Bye, everyone.